Thank you very much for having me at this conference. I've never done a Zoom conference before. I was hoping to avoid them entirely during Corona, but here we go. This is something of a work in progress, essentially, and it's based more or less on my research for my doctorate, which was on why the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded. And fortunately, I got the travel stipend from the German Archaeological Institute and had the opportunity to look at lots of places far away from Assyria that influenced it, to try and get some new ideas. This is what I hope to bring to the table with the talk today. And also, I'm going to try and sort of talk around the main sources on Assyria and Edom, sort of provide some alternate perspectives. As of course, Errol Bag is speaking straight after me, and I expect that, sorry, got a bit of a cough right now. Anyway, so let's start. Anyway, so the first thing I want to emphasize here is with this expansion, which we see starting, of course, in the 10th century, solidifying there afterwards, and then finally moving on to the Assyria we all know and love just before Tiglath-Pileser III, and very big expansion which comes and takes a hold of the Levant, is that during this period we also see the beginnings of really quite exciting, extensive trade contacts that haven't entirely been joined together as much as they should be. And I'd like to very quickly, before I move on to our main topic, of course, Northern Arabian trade, is worth mentioning briefly Tarshish, Tartessos, which is very exciting. We know, of course, everybody knows the standard thing, Ashurnasirpal II turns up, he gets his tribute from the kings of the sea, and similar, this is, and then thereafter, he leaves. And this is generally seen as the beginning of then this sort of movement that leads to the imperialism, which will finally end in Tiglath-Pileser conquering everything. What's very exciting, of course, now is the information that has been found archaeologically of, so to speak, Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, Morocco, which has begun to sort of place this archaeologically. And what's very exciting, in fact, are the carbon-14 dates coming out of this, where we see, for example, these wonderful Phoenician workshops at Huelva, at La Banadia from the last quarter of the 9th century. There are also now the very exciting evidence from Utica, carbon-14 dated, of a feast happening sometime between the late 10th to the early 9th century, so on the Tunisian coast already. And then, of course, now very, very recently and excitingly, there's this Iberian hack silver, for example, from Tildor, which must date from between the 11th to the 9th century BC. So all of a sudden, we can see this trade forming before Assyria is even getting there, and we're finally getting this sense of causation, which is what really interests and excites me. And this is important because we can try and look in the same way about what's going on in the Red Sea. And of course, if one thinks about this, even Ezekiel mentions in the same breath Tarshish and Sheba. Anyway, with this, obviously, I don't know a vast amount about this topic, but a little sort of amuse-gueule, as it were, for what might come out of further research is what the German Archaeological Institute are doing at Yeha in Ethiopia, where there are these large palatial structures. This is the most striking of them, the Grat Beal Gebri, which has been carbon-14 dated to around 800 BC. Most excitingly, in very recent excavations in front of the church, they've noticed that the settlement goes back to the end of the 2nd century BC. So we have also this interesting culture, which may be a sort of mix of Ethiopian and Sabaean elements. It's uncertain, and I'm not the one who's exactly going to judge it at all, but this is also forming roughly the same sort of era. And this also, I think, needs to feed into how we begin to see this Northern Arabian trade. Anyway, that said, I'd like to move on to things slightly more Assyrian. That was sort of, as it were, the impetus for my talk. And here, very importantly, I'm going to sort of gloss over the main discussion of Arabia to move on to some very sort of solid points, because otherwise we could talk for hours about the fascinating interactions between Assyrians and Arabians. So the period in which the majority of this interaction happens is obviously near the end of the empire. Most famously, we might think of Ashurbanipal and the Arabs. Of course, the first really sort of solid interaction happens during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, when he defeats Queen Shamshi and so forth. that's sort of, what I'm going to do now essentially is I'm going to talk about the first evidence we directly have of this Sabaean trade coming from northern Arabia into Mesopotamia. Then I'm going to backtrack a little bit to what we can see in the 10th and the 9th centuries on the Middle Euphrates. And then I'm going to bring us up right to the point where Tiglath-Pileser III gets involved with Edom, and I'm going to leave it there, essentially. This is my road plan for the rest of the talk. And what's important, of course, is that the first proper contact we have of Sabaeans comes from this very interesting little text from Suhu, the modern-day Anat in Iraq, where the local ruler, who sort of set himself up as something of a king during this period, goes on about a caravan that he waylays, which comes from Tema and from Sheba. And what's very interesting is that he lists the merchandise taken, which involves, among other things, this interesting argamanu, this very striking wool, which is, I guess, Phoenician in origin, in fact, iron. No mention of incense, sadly, because that's exactly what one would be hoping for to come out of Ethiopia or similar, but very interestingly, these papadilu stones, which also turn up in other Arab tributes later. So we can place this to probably the first half of the 8th century. This is the earliest evidence we have of this trade, unless we sort of try and look back, as we're going to do now, to the Euphrates in the 10th to 9th centuries and see what's going on there. No mention of Sabaeans, but it seems as if these trade routes are really happening. It's important to note before I get to that very quickly that there are things very much missing from our view. Among other things, a massive problem still in understanding these northern Assyrian trade routes, northern Arabian trade routes, is that there is no mention of Palmyra. There's no Tadmor that appears in Neo-Assyrian sources, which is a real pain because you would expect it. And of course, it's mentioned in Middle Assyrian sources and is mentioned thereafter. And, how exactly this is to be resolved is still unclear to me, to be honest. It's something of an open question. Anyway, let us move on now to the struggle for the Middle Euphrates. I should mention, by the way, these are photographs I took during my journey, this travel stipend of different places. Some of them from, this one is from Tema. Anyway, so we have a very interesting situation in the 10th to 9th century on the Euphrates. The Middle East is recovering from the hangover that is the Dark Age, and we have these different polities that develop along the Euphrates, Dini, Ake, which is going to be important, Hindanu, and Suhu, and Assyria is up there to north, hanging around Durkat Limu. Now, what's very interesting is that the earlier than people BC. It's just that my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully you got that. 905 BC, when Edom II turns up in the area. We can deduce this from a breach within a broken part of his annals, and the rather charming to the second, commemorating his dad destroying Lache. Very interestingly, of course, if one looks at the Luvian inscriptions, we have this Laka riverland that turns up in the Hama inscriptions. How we chronologically date them is another issue. It's very interesting because it may show that Hama previously had controlled this area before the Assyrians turned up. Anyway, this is a picture of the stele. It's quite charming, isn't it? It's probably local, and then Tukulti-Ninurta II stuck his inscription on it later. Anyway, what's interesting about this in turn is that we have his campaign. It's very brief, but this is a later campaign of 894 and not the one of 905, which must have been nasty, as we can see from the inscription at Turka. But this one is much nicer. He doesn't attack anybody. He just goes along collecting tribute in various places, including one, amusingly enough, called Zurich, which, yes, I often laugh about. Anyway, so what's interesting here, though, is that this tribute is not particularly interesting. It's quite dull. To be fair, Adonore II also does not depict tribute anywhere near as splendidly as later Neo-Assyrian kings. This still isn't as interesting a topic within annals of this time. Nonetheless, if we move on from 894 to the doings of his son, Tukulti-Ninurta II, then we see a very different image. I've sort of compiled the tribute that he gets when he goes down the Tigris, the Euphrates, apologies, and it's very much different. We see, among other things, myrrh turning up, muru. There's an argument how one interprets it, if it's actually myrrh or if it's another aromatic of the time. That doesn't matter. It's clearly coming from Arabia. We also have all of this gold and silver turning up out of nowhere furniture, probably coming from it's Indian sisu wood, probably all of this. So out of nowhere, as Adam Ver has suggested, we have a boom going on the Euphrates. All of a sudden, all sorts of trade and commerce is going on where it wasn't previously. Now, this could just be a fluke of the Neo-Assyrian annals, were it not for what happens thereafter during the reign of Ashurnasirpal II. Here we see a very, very intensive battle over control of this route down the Euphrates from the three different powers we have here, from Beta Dini, from Assyria, and from Babylonia, who aren't on this map, but come up via Suhu. And one sees this first in 883. This is only 3 years after Tukulti-Ninurta has collected all this nice stuff. When a revolt breaks out, Beta Dini attempts to place a new ruler on the throne of Halupe, Beta Halupe. So Ashurnasirpal turns up and he sorts this all out and leaves. But not all that much later, in 878, things have gotten much worse. He has to turn up again and sort the situation out once more. And this time it's Babylonia that's behind it. And quite a large battle occurs, as he mentions, directly with Babylonian forces, breaking the sort of uneasy truce that had existed between these nations previously. This is particularly interesting when one looks back at the campaign of Tukulti-Ninurta II I mentioned once more. The interesting thing there is that Tukulti-Ninurta II collects this tribute despite a truce that's occurred with Babylonia at this time. He very sneakily goes down to Babylonia, visits various temples, leaving offerings, and then travels up the Euphrates, and as soon as he's out of Babylonian territory, collects as much tribute as he can. So this shows already, again, this sort of crazy rush to control this trade route. Finally, we have one more campaign, which sadly can't be dated because of the rarities of Ashurnasirpal's annals, which are patchy at best, which is a real pain for Assyriologists. And once more, Beta Dini attempts to influence this area, put its own people in power, and Assyria really goes to town this time, goes all the way to the Jebel Bishri, killing huge amounts of Lakians and similar. And this pretty much ends this situation. Shalmaneser III doesn't have to fight any campaigns during his own reign. But what's interesting is that the provinces that develop afterwards, including Rasapa in this area, are huge and clearly far too powerful. Shalmaneser III, among other things, takes the magnate who had been ruling in Ratsapa and sticks him up in Nairi, in modern-day Diyarbakir, to try and get him away from his power base. And later on, probably after Shamshi V or similar, the provinces actually get split up. So Hindanu becomes a province, Laku becomes a province. Suhu has been doing its own thing, to be honest, the whole time. What's important is that this place is too rich, it's too powerful. Anyway, so that's my depiction of what's going on between the 10th and 9th centuries. And what I'd like to do briefly, and this is a very odd on a campaign 878 of Ashurnasirpal II, where he goes past the Beit Shabaya along the way. And this is very fascinating because it hasn't entirely been explained as to who this group are. They only appear once very briefly in the entirety of Assyrian history. And one possible explanation could be that this is some sort of strange reference to Sabaeans potentially putting things early. I don't want to put too much weight on this because it's missing. Shaba-a-ya is interesting. There's and the sheen, of course, if we look back, it's also written with a sheen rather than a scene. But who knows? It's just an idea. Another one is that it's Garbaya, which comes from a root, which means sort of skin condition. Garbanu, of course, we have in Assyrian texts. It's translated normally as leprosy. It isn't, because leprosy did not reach the Middle East by Assyria. It was still in India. It took probably until about the classical era before people started getting leprosy. Rather, this must be a very early reference to non-venereal syphilis, known as Bejel in Arabic, which was endemic to this region, to precisely the area that he went by until about the 1940s, when the British finally eradicated it. One other possibility is that it comes from Sabah in Aramaic, which just means old. So it could be Sabaeans, syphilitics, or the senile, terrible joke, sorry. One of the three, who knows? But it's just a little tidbit I wanted to add. So let's tie it all up together in the last minutes. And what's important now is that I'd like to go to this situation just as as Tiglath-Pileser III turns up on the scene, what he does with Edom. I've described now the importance of this trade route down the Middle Euphrates, which must be connected in turn to this northern Arabian trade. And so here is the situation, more or less. Tiglath-Pileser fascinatingly crosses the traditional boundary of Assyria into the Levant and very swiftly proceeds to not only knock the Aratians trying to influence the area out of the fight, but then to carry on and take most of the Levant. Now I'd like to move on to the last text we're going to discuss very briefly, and it is this first reference to his well, not conquest, his doings in the area. And this is a larger section which follows the section on Edom we'll see next. And here he discusses all of these different Arab cities and groups. Some of them are listed as cities, others are listed as groups. The Idibiail, as we'll talk about, for example. And what's interesting is that they turn up, they give him a tribute. This involves the aromatics, the camels, everything we expect. And one chap, Idibi-Ilu, who seems to be, I guess, the chap running the tribe of the same name, this would be logical, I guess, gets a gatekeeper facing Egypt, an Atu in Akkadian, which is very interesting because this term doesn't seem to be used anywhere else really in Assyrian inscriptions, to my knowledge at least. It could be I might have missed one, but he's been given a special role, and he is not an Edomite, but he's ultimately policing an area which falls within the Edomite remit. And this is interesting because the next paragraph now, this one with Edom, we come to this here, and here we see this long listing of different levels. Ending would be Ammon, Moab, and then wonderful, and the different geographically they're connected. And what I'd like then to do finally is to tie this all together in a conclusion for you. So there must have been a thriving trade going on in the Red Sea by the early 9th century, we assume, from what we have in Ethiopia, if nothing else. I haven't talked about the Sabaean sources. That's beyond my current remit. What's interesting, of course, is that this Arabian trade route enters the Assyrian view really quite early. And it's fought over for a while until Assyria finally takes control of it. And I would argue that this finally informed how Tiglath-Pileser III got to work on Edom when he first got there on the spot. And one thing that's interesting, two more things very briefly. One is, of course, if we look at 2 Kings 16:6, the Edomites grab Elath, the port, as it were, still today, Mon Aqaba and Eilat on the other side. And they're both essentially the same port, parts Israel, parts Jordan. They grab this during the chaos of Tiglath-Pileser taking over the Levant, and this carries on until, so to speak, the present day when Chronicles ends. And the second point is that Assyria keeps a hands-off stance. This is very interesting. They do the same thing, obviously, with the Phoenicians. They're tired, they can't take it. They understand there's this trade, they need it. In the Zagros, we see the same things. They control mountain passes, but they cannot source the horses themselves until very late in the empire. And here we see, potentially with Edom, another example of this. And what's interesting, again, is Babylonia, Neo-Babylonia, once afterwards, actually does take Tyre, does get involved in all of this trade stuff, maybe with disastrous consequences, and equally, as has been shown so fascinatingly yesterday, also gets involved directly in Edom. If we look at Sela, for example, in the inscription there. So with that, I'll leave you. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your comments. Thanks.